Broadcasting to Liskeard, South East Cornwall and the globe. You're listening to Liskeard Radio.
Good afternoon, you're listening to Liskeard Radio. I'm Mike Allsop and we're live on air and streaming via Mixcloud and social media platforms. This afternoon I'm joined by Sue Dobson, whose book Burned, The Spy South Africa Never Caught is a story of espionage, deceit, intrigue, death threats and honey traps in South Africa during the apartheid government rule in the 1980s. What is most intriguing is that this is actually a true life story of my guest, written some 30 years after her hurried escape from her would-be prosecutors and persecutors and her eventual exile settlement in the UK. So I'll say good afternoon, Sue.
Good afternoon, Mike.
Now, I've read your book. It's fascinating and at times quite a disturbing read. So can I start by asking you about your early years as a young, white, middle-class and privileged, may I say, girl in South Africa in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I had a very conventional upbringing as a white South African girl, and I was fortunate enough to be born into a middle-class family. And as a white South African at the time, I had the privileges that white South Africans had in the 60s and 70s. And it was a very, I'd say I was very fortunate. I had access to education and good health care. I had some stability in my family, and I was a lot more fortunate than children of colour in my country. And unfortunately, not all of us had the same opportunities or the same possibilities open to us because of race and the policy of apartheid, which was very much at its heyday in the 60s and 70s. And there was a lot of discrimination between people of white people and black people, and that was enforced by legislature. In fact, that became the law of the country. And there was a different way of life for black people and a different way of life for white people, where white people had access to privilege and people of colour didn't. And that was the environment in which I grew up. And it sounds sort of very disturbing to describe that, but it meant that people of colour had inferior education, inferior healthcare, inferior opportunities, and it was an environment of great inequality, and obviously that bred a great deal of resentment at the time.
Okay, now can you give me one or two examples of the kind of things? I know you've got things such as blacks only beaches or whites only beaches, what other things would you come across?
Well, Mike, what you're talking about is something called petty apartheid. There was also something called grand apartheid, which was the rules of the land, if you like, the laws of the land. But petty apartheid was where it seems like very ridiculous things were enforced, like there were benches for white people and benches for black people, for instance, and there was a notice on each that said whites only, or slegs blankes in Afrikaans. Okay. And you had an entrance to a building that only black people could use and an entrance that white people could use. We had separate transport, we had separate schools, we had separate education systems. So every aspect of life was determined by the colour of your skin, which obviously in this day and age is highly reprehensible. It's a very distasteful concept. And unfortunately, that was the rule of the land in that time. And we grew up like that, where unfortunately there was distrust amongst South Africans because of colour, because of race. And whereas in ordinary circumstances one would not be conscious of race, in South Africa at that time one was acutely conscious of race and colour, and it became a huge issue. In the national psychology, if you like. It was something that South Africans were constantly aware of.
Was there any one moment that stirred you up to do something about the situation?
I think there was. When I was about 14, there was the Soweto uprisings in 1976, and I witnessed some of the scenes of that uprising on the TV. TV had only recently come to South Africa, and on the news at night, they was covering these riots. And I was acutely conscious of the fact that these were teenagers like myself. The only difference was that they were a different color. And it struck me that there was no one who was responsible for these kids, that they were going through this anger and this turmoil, and that they were actually protesting about something as basic as the medium of education that they were being taught in. They wanted to be taught in their own language, in their own mother tongue, which is a perfectly reasonable request, or in English. And the Afrikaner government at the time, the nationalist government, was forcing these children to be taught in Afrikaans. And they saw Afrikaans as the language of the oppressor, as the language of the government that upheld the policy of apartheid or discrimination amongst different races, and therefore they found this completely reprehensible. And these children started to protest peacefully, and unfortunately the police turned on them during one of the marches and fired with live ammunition, killing many of them and wounding many of them. And I witnessed some of that coverage, and as a teenager I felt profoundly touched by that and the injustice of that, and felt that I could not be part of any system that upheld that.
Now, would it be fair to say then that if you decide you're going to do something about that, you would be in effect betraying your own country, the privileged upbringing that you had, and clearly not something you could discuss with parents and family? So who did you approach?
Well, I didn't. It was a very isolated time for me, and I was a teenager going through the things that teenagers go through at the time, all that sort of growing up that one has to do emotionally and psychologically and physically, and being profoundly unhappy with what I was living in and wanting very much to change that. But because of the policy of discrimination, because of apartheid, people of different races were kept apart. So I never knew any black people directly, and I felt so isolated. I thought that I would never be able to contribute to what I saw as a struggle for a democratic South Africa. And in effect, I had to wait several years before I had the opportunity to do that. But in those years, my resolve hardened, and I became more and more determined that that was something that I had to do, that I could not witness that injustice and I could not be part of it.
Now, in those years, you studied journalism, I believe, at which university?
Well, I finished my education at school and I went on to Wits University, or the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And I actually studied a social science degree. I majored in psychology. And then when I'd finished my degree, I went into journalism, and I started working at a local newspaper.
Okay, tell me a little bit about the time, because it wasn't exactly the university experience that we might encounter, say, in the UK.
No, certainly not. There were very few black students at the university that I went to at the time, and those that attended had to be there by special permission, or they were there on some sort of bursary or grant provided by charities at the time. And they were in a very, very distinct minority, and those students were, I think it's fair to say, under constant surveillance by the security police, who saw them as a threat to the security of the university, and who also saw them as a possible source of subversive activity against the apartheid government. And there was this constant, shall we say, pressure at university where one was trying to learn and one was trying to spread one's wings and look at the wider picture, if you like, of international politics and South Africa's role in the world. And yet, when there were meetings or there were protests against the government, the security police would be brought in to the campus and they would use very heavy-handed methods to subdue the students. Students were beaten, sometimes they were tear-gassed, sometimes there were water cannons used against the students. They were beaten, arrested, photographed, and in effect, the voice of protest was silenced at university, and it became a very, I'd say, a very frightened atmosphere in which one tried to learn and tried to spread your wings, but were actually not given the real opportunity to do so politically.
Okay, now you've said that there was an infiltration at the university. Now, before we go on to about your espionage training, give me the little bridge towards that between the university and how you got to be given your training. Well,
it sort of took place over a period of some years, and I was fortunate at the age of probably 18 or 19 to be introduced to a member of the ANC through a family contact, and I expressed my frustration at what I saw was going on around me and my wish to actually work for a democratic South Africa and to join the ANC, because I believed that the ANC was the way to achieve that. And then I had a document called the Freedom Charter, which outlined the aims for a democratic South Africa and what one would work towards and what one hoped to achieve. And I really believed in the Freedom Charter. And I was actually very fortunate to be given the name of a contact in London who I went to see. I actually went to London and I met this person, and he was called Aziz Pahad, and he was a senior member of the ANC executive at the time, and he was responsible for, let's say, vetting recruits to the movement. And we had a meeting, and he actually sort of grilled me quite extensively. And to my disappointment somewhat, he said, well, you know, that's all well and good, but you have to learn discipline. You have to learn to live a legend if you want to work for us. And if you can do that, if you can pretend to be an ordinary white South African, and you can live a legend and not portray your real political feelings or political identity, then come back to us in a few years' time and we may be able to offer you the opportunity for training and the chance to join the ANC. And that is exactly what I did. I returned to South Africa and I, for want of a better word, integrated myself into the communities that I came from. And I pretended to be apolitical. I pretended to not be interested in politics at all. And eventually, and we're talking about many years later, after I'd worked on several newspapers and after I'd worked in the broadcast field, I had the opportunity to return to London, and I met Ronnie Casrels, who was a military intelligence officer in the armed wing of the African National Congress called Umkhonto we Sizwe. And I was interviewed by Ronnie, I met him, and he offered me the opportunity for training as an intelligence officer and a position in the ANC.
I mean, initially I would imagine they were very sceptical about you. You were a white person trying to join the ANC and help out, but then you passed and you're going on to your espionage training, or you were given it, but your training took place in Cold War Russia.
It certainly did.
Now, without going too far into modern day politics, it's probably fair to say that in the midst of the current Ukraine conflict, Vladimir Putin's Russia is considered almost globally hostile. Tell me about the 80s regime under Mikhail Gorbachev.
Well, as you say, this was actually played out in the days of the Cold War. And the liberation movements in southern Africa, several of those liberation movements were actually supported by the then USSR. And the reason for that was that they felt that these governments were undergoing changes, and there were political changes that were moving towards socialism, and the USSR felt that they could actually nurture those changes politically, psychologically, educationally, if you like, and they became involved in the liberation struggle in several countries in Africa, and helped with education, helped with arming the struggle, helped with military combat work, if you like, education in the military field, and actually nurtured those liberation movements. And that was the case with the ANC, in that they received assistance from the Soviet Union, although that was kept extremely quiet at the time because it was considered extremely unpleasant. And even at that time, South Africans were very frightened of the Soviet Union. They felt that the Soviet Union wanted their natural resources, etc. This was all part of propaganda put out by the South African government at the time. But my experience of Russia when I got there, and I'd say rather the Soviet Union, was a society that was incredibly nurturing to me and provided me with an education and a set of skills that actually kept me alive later on. And at that time, it was an incredibly interesting period in history, in Russian history, in that Mikhail Gorbachev was the president, and there was a policy of perestroika, or openness towards the West. And the West sort of greeted this with open arms, because they felt for the first time there was better communication with the Soviet Union, and that some of the hostilities of the past and history might actually be addressed, and that there could be better cooperation. And I certainly was very touched by what I saw, even on the streets in Moscow, where people would come and demonstrate for peace during their lunch breaks. They would go to the parks in Moscow, and you would see people holding placards saying, wanting peace, and speaking out against the possibility of Star Wars, which was something that Reagan was pursuing at the time. And what everyone wanted was global peace.
Now, a couple of little stories I wanted. First and foremost, your training took about 7 months, am I right?
It certainly did, and it was quite intensive.
And so I'm going to lead you towards this by saying, how does a young lady disappear for 7 months? What excuse does she come up with?
Well, the young lady in question had a legend that she lived to, and unfortunately, or fortunately for them really, friends and family knew nothing about that legend. And the reason for that legend, when I talk about a legend, that's my story, if you like. It's my cover story. I disappeared to go backpacking in Europe for 7 months. And of course, I didn't go backpacking in Europe for 7 months. I had my military training in the Soviet Union instead. And I sent postcards home diligently from several European centres. And my
How did that work? How did that work?
Well, it was quite a sophisticated thing, really. My bodyguard come translator had collected a series of postcards from European centres, if you like, you know. So my family received postcards from Rome and Naples and you know, places all over Greece, and Holland and Spain. Some of these places I'd never seen, and I still haven't seen. But I sat diligently in the apartment in Moscow and wrote out these postcards, telling everyone what a wonderful time I was having. And then my Russian friends would make sure that they were posted in the West and then sent home to my family in South Africa. So my family thought I was having a wonderful time.
Absolutely.
A
Absolutely.
bit sneaky, really.
So your legend served you well.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And I mean, the reason to have a legend is that one actually has to believe in that legend and one has to live it and be extremely disciplined. And there is no such thing as having the opportunity to let your hair down or, you know, sort of talk about that to anybody. You just can't do that. You have to believe your legend and live your legend entirely in order to be successful.
What I'd like to say, going back to your training, just briefly, because you've mentioned it to me when we've spoken before, about the sort of things that, when you were training, the sort of equipment that you dealt with.
Well, it wasn't exactly it wasn't exactly light stuff, you could say. My training was quite comprehensive, really. Primarily, I was an intelligence officer, so I was trained in surveillance and counter-surveillance and the techniques of an intelligence officer would use. And, you know, that involved surveillance, counter-surveillance, dead letter drops, communication, codes, etc. But in addition to that, there was a more conventional military aspect to my training, such as radio work, explosives, and that meant also arms training. So I would be firing a rocket launcher. I learned how to handle an AK-47. I learned how to deal with the equipment that the South African Defence Force or the South African Police would use, and how to actually survive in the field with that equipment. And also there was a sort of more unsavoury element to that. Unfortunately, that was an era where landmines were used in conflict, and I was taught how to lay them, what damage they would do. Also things like limpet mines, grenades, that sort of thing, booby traps, hand-to-hand combat, how to be a sniper, and all sorts of things like that. There was also a, you know, sort of political theory, if you like, the theory of socialism and communism, and also the history of the Soviet Union and the history of the Russian Revolution and how one could actually learn from that and apply those techniques in modern day warfare. So it was quite a comprehensive training.
Sounds like it. That sounds like it. Now, what I'm going to say to you is, before we go further, I have had a message come through. I've had a couple of messages. You've probably noticed me messing. One's, good evening, Mike and Sue. I'm South African and grew up during the apartheid times. And I have so much respect for your bravery and your fight against the apartheid.
Thank
so
you
that's
very
very
much.
nice. So I've said I'd pass that on.
Thank you.
And I've got one or two other people that actually have South African backgrounds that are listening in tonight.
Right,
So
sure.
hopefully, if they are
There may
interested,
be some mixed feelings.
there may be some mixed feelings. But if they want to come online and just to pass a note, they can either do it through our Facebook or through Mixcloud. So they should be able to find out that. I'll carry on. Tell me a little bit about South African propaganda at that time, particularly in relation to Namibia.
Well, I must say that Namibia, or what was known as Southwest Africa or German Southwest Africa, was considered by many South Africans as to be an extension of South Africa. And South Africa fought very hard to prevent the independence of Namibia. And it so happened that I was active in the ANC at the time, where Namibia was heading towards free and fair elections under the United Nations Resolution 435, which entailed the withdrawal of South African troops from Namibia, where they were on the border with Angola. There'd been some conflict between the Angolan liberation movements and the South Africans for many years at that point. But certainly the propaganda machine in South Africa in the 80s was going into overdrive, really, because South Africa was actually besieged from all sides at that point. It was actually being brought to its knees by sanctions. And I think one has to be under no illusion about the fact that the changes that were brought about in South Africa were actually brought about through economic pressure, and certainly not through any altruistic means or wishes by the then apartheid government. They were forced to make those changes. They didn't want to. So I, at the time, was actually working for the Bureau for Information, which was the propaganda department of the apartheid government. I had been very fortunate in that I'd been able to infiltrate that organization and pass through the security clearances, etc., to get there. And I had been picked to work on the campaigns to prevent the independence of Namibia, which was a very sort of covert group that were sent up to Namibia to do sort of dirty tricks, if you like.
Now you say that you passed the tests, the security test.
Yes.
At this stage, what did that security test?
There were several levels of clearance, and initially, if you worked for something like the Broadcast Corporation, the SABC, you would just have your information submitted and someone would check it over and decide if you were okay. And the more involved you became in government departments, and I was very fortunate in that I had several opportunities present themselves to me where I could infiltrate government organizations and departments. And perhaps I was very fortunate because of the strength of my legend, and also because I am very ordinary, seemingly very ordinary, and therefore didn't arouse suspicion. And one of my clearances involved a face-to-face interview with a security policeman in Pretoria. I had to go to security police headquarters in Pretoria and present myself, which I did. And this gentleman sort of looked me up and down, this sort of very unpleasant gentleman looked me up and down and said, "Hey lady, how do you feel about living next door to blacks?" And that was the extent of my security clearance. And I left and I passed, and that was that.
There were only two answers, weren't there?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, you
picked the right one.
I certainly did. And I was quite astonished at the method of delivery, if you like. I was expecting something a lot more rigorous, but that's what I got. And then as you became, I suppose, more entrenched in a government department, so your security clearance changed. And if you had any contact with government ministers or the state president at the time, who was F.W. de Klerk, you would have to undergo the third degree, if you like, it sounds ominous, of security clearance, which was a lot more rigorous. And they would look at family contacts, etc., which was how my cover was blown eventually.
Well, we'll come back to that in a bit, because there's one or two things. I mean, I believe that you were able to interview the likes of Peek Botha, the South African Minister of Internal Affairs. But then you met with a colonel of the police.
I did.
A certain Mr. Heston de Bruin. Have I said it right?
Yes, you did. Heston de Bruin.
So, a three-part question. What was he involved in? How did you meet him? And basically, who was he?
Well, it's sort of quite a big question, that. I was very fortunate in that as a journalist working for the Bureau for Information, I worked on a political journal, and that political journal was called RSA Policy Review, which was dead boring, really. It was just interviews with these really boring hideous government ministers, and talking about the policies and the changes they were making, etc. But some of those interviews were actually quite important and quite strategic. And one of them was with Pik Botha, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And Pik Botha was very much involved in the creation and the carrying out of a program to destabilize the United Nations Resolution 435 for the independence of Namibia and for free and fair elections for Namibia. And we had quite a rigorous interview, but it had to be completely vetted by Pik himself. He had to agree on all the questions. And a lot of those interviews were like that. I mean, I interviewed Marty Atasari, the UN representative who was currently covering the independence of Namibia, and also people like the South African Administrator General. So I was fortunate to interview a lot of the people who were involved in that process and to look at the policies. And part of that was also to go up to the Northern Territory, Oshakati and Ondangwa, where the troops were allegedly withdrawing from Namibia. In actual fact, the withdrawal of South African troops was very slow, and there was still the operation of a paramilitary group called Kufut up there, and they were actually eliminating the SWAPO cadres, the fighters who represented the Southwest Africa People's Organization, who were working towards the independence of Namibia. Kufut would eliminate those fighters as they came over the border. And all this activity was actually still going on, despite Resolution 435 wanting that to cease. And Heston de Bruyn was the police representative up in that area. And as a result, he had a lot of the information about what was going on at that particular time. And he was an extremely useful contact to have, and that was a contact that I sought out, obviously.
Okay. Now, this is what became the honey trap.
It is, and I must mention also that Heston, that's not his real name, but we've had to give him another name for the purpose of the book.
Yeah. And so, how did that come about?
Well, let me put it this way. The honey trap is perhaps a less conventional method of extracting information from a significant person. It is not necessarily an easy method. It is something where one has to be extremely disciplined and very clear and very grounded about what you're doing. And suffice to say that the end justifies the means, I think, is probably the clearest way of explaining that.
Okay. Now, I would say that he was probably a ruthless advocate of the apartheid movement, and here he is basically sleeping with an ANC spy. How did you get away with that?
I suppose opportunities presented themselves, and I took advantage of those opportunities, and I had to be very vigilant. I had to be very controlled. I had to be very careful, and I was always very conscious of him at that point. I had to learn how to read his behavior quite acutely, really. And I suppose I was extremely fortunate in that I lived to tell the tale.
How was he towards you? Did he respect you?
It's hard to say. I think he probably respected me as a journalist. I'm not too sure how he felt about me as a woman and as a person. But I would think that his opinion of me certainly changed once he found out I was an ANC operative. I think that's safe to say. But it was it's one of those things that happen in the theatre of war. And you have to remember that we were at war. And we had an enemy, and there are certain techniques and certain operations that take place in the theatre of war that may seem unpalatable or unconventional. But once again, the end justifies the means. And that is something I think that one has to keep in the forefront of your mind.
Is this something that you did off your own initiative when the opportunity presented itself, or did you get clearance to do this?
I was not given clearance, and
did you ask for clearance?
I did ask for clearance, and because of the lines of communication being, I'd say, somewhat muddied by I'm not quite sure what, I must stress also that communication was extremely difficult with your handler. And, one couldn't meet in South Africa. One had to meet in neighbouring countries. And it was very difficult to receive instruction, and it was very difficult to interpret that. And certainly, if you're operating in a very tight time schedule and you have to take advantage of those opportunities when they present themselves, then sometimes you can't lean very heavily on your handler. You have to take initiative. You have to have the confidence and the strength in order to do that. And opportunities are very important, I think, in intelligence work. And one has to take advantage of those opportunities and fly with them when they present themselves. And that really, I think, explains, probably to the best of my ability, what happened with the honey trap affair, in that there was a series of opportunities that presented themselves, and I flew with those. And I tried to get feedback, I tried to get guidance, I tried to get instruction, but communication was not what it should be. And unfortunately, there weren't clear communications on that.
Okay, now, having read your book, there were two occasions that I found quite fascinating. Firstly, the occasion where you were left alone at De Bruyn's house.
Right.
And you had the opportunity to search for... I'm not going to go greatly into what you took and how you took it, because I'm sure there's all sorts of
operational
issues,
work.
operational
I can't
stuff.
really talk about the details.
But suffice to say, you were looking for...
I was looking for information.
Yeah. And there was an occasion when you were left alone at his house.
That's right.
Can you tell me just briefly about that?
I had taken opportunity to look around when I was left alone in the house, and I ended up staying in the house because there was a shortage of accommodation for journalists at the time up in the Northern Territory, and I was very fortunate, I suppose, that he offered me the opportunity to stay in his house. But what he didn't realise was that I was going through his documents when he wasn't there. And I had access to some of his filing cabinets and some of the scrapbooks and papers that he kept. And I certainly made use of that opportunity to pass on some of the information that I received through looking through those things.
And first, another fascinating thing: how did you record that information?
Well, part of my training was what we called secret writing. Now, you can actually write things with lemon juice, believe it or not. And I did that. I copied relevant information in lemon juice into some notebooks, which looked perfectly ordinary, and the pages looked blank, and information was conveyed back to South Africa like that, and then passed on to the handler eventually.
And for anybody that wants to write in lemon juice in the future and use that,
it's painstaking, I can assure you.
And how do you get the writing up?
Well, now that's the secret.
I'm going to blast that one out because it's heat. Heat, is it not?
Well, I would say the best thing one could do is Google it. You didn't hear it from my lips.
Okay. Now, I said there were two bits that I wanted to talk about, and secondly is the opportunity for you to actually eliminate De Bruyne.
Yeah, that opportunity presented itself a few times, and I've got to say that he had a checkered career as a security policeman. He had, I'd say, significant success in infiltrating the student movement in the 1970s. And as a result of that, some of the intelligence he passed on as a security policeman in the South African security police force was that those student leaders or student members had actually been arrested and sometimes tortured, and they had paid the price for what they believed in. So he was, to some extent, a well-known character to the ANC.
And this was including at your own university?
This was at my university, and in fact this was a point of contact really between us, in that we had both been on the same campus, and we, not at the same time, but we had shared similar experiences of university life. And I suppose that, when one is staying with someone and one is in a relationship with someone, there becomes an opportunity where that person is quite vulnerable on occasion. And you can actually take advantage of that. If, for instance, if they're asleep in front of you and they have a loaded gun on the bedside table, one has to weigh up the possibilities of, do I take the role of assassin or do I not? And then one has to think, well, that's not my instruction, that's not my brief. And there may be bigger fish to fry. There may be other things that are more significant and other areas where I'm more useful, and that perhaps I shouldn't take that opportunity to end that person's life.
Okay. But can I just say, at one stage you had the gun in your hand?
I absolutely did.
You did.
Yeah.
And
I thought better of it.
you thought better of it.
I
And
did.
Yeah, that's it. No, it was a choice, and that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, and you made the choice.
Yeah, it was a choice.
Now, how much direction were you getting from Ronnie at this stage?
Unfortunately, as I explained earlier, contact was extremely difficult because one couldn't meet in South Africa, because Ronnie was obviously very high profile. He was constantly sought by the South Africans, but would manage to slip in and out of South Africa with a series of disguises, but not for any extended period. So meeting with him to pass on information would have to take place in a neighboring country, for instance in Swaziland or in Botswana. And that takes time to organize. One has to coordinate your own movements and your own cover story and your own legend. And also you've got to bear in mind that Ronnie would be coming from wherever it was in the world that he was at that particular time to come and meet you. So there are so many things that can go wrong. And also bearing in mind that things crop up for people in sort of senior positions like that. There may be a political scandal of some sort, or somebody's been arrested, or there has been a crisis of some sort, and your meeting might get called off. And that means that you're left high and dry. You might have information that you need to pass on. It might be something that's very urgent, where you need an answer. And sometimes you just have to take that initiative. You have to make that decision, rightly or wrongly. But that's what it means to be in the field.
Now,
it's a responsibility you take.
Now, we've talked about your legend, and the success of your legend, as we've spoken before, was your inevitable downfall, because I believe you were headhunted by the office of F.W. de Klerk.
I was.
To join his team?
Yes, I was approached and asked if I would be interested in being a media officer in F.W.'s department. And for an intelligence operative, it was an absolute wonderful opportunity that could not be overlooked. And I was aware at the time that this was potentially extremely dangerous, and that perhaps it was going too fast, too quickly, too high, and we would have to go through the security clearance, the inevitable security clearance, to get close to FW. And again, I wasn't able to take advice. I wasn't able to take instruction on that. And I made the decision that this was worth doing. And that certainly if I had managed to bluff my way through previous security clearances, I would probably be able to get myself through this one. And that's what I tried to do.
Okay.
And unfortunately, that's where they checked up and they found the ANC family connection.
So, tell me about that phone call.
That phone call, well, that was a phone call I will never forget. It was a phone call that changed the course of my life. I was in the house in Namibia where I was, as I said, I was part of the Dirty Tricks campaign. We were all in the house in Windhoek and the phone rang and I was called to the phone, and it was an empty room because they hadn't furnished this house properly for us. They were not prepared for us coming, etc. And there was just this telephone in the middle of the room, sitting there, sort of like this ugly black Bakelite government telephone, if you like, where we received instruction from Pretoria. And the caller said, "Don't go anywhere. Stay where you are. We're coming up to get you, to accompany you to Pretoria for the interview with FW." Now, this caller didn't identify themselves. They spoke with a strong Afrikaans accent. It was not somebody I knew. Bearing in mind that I also spoke Afrikaans fluently, and I understood that this was not the way that one would normally travel, because I moved backwards and forwards across Southern Africa with ease. I would take military flights from Pretoria to Namibia and back again. And I knew that I certainly didn't need somebody to accompany me. And I realized then that the game was up and that it must have been the security clearance. And it turned out that that was the case.
And how did you escape? I mean, surveillance must have been all over you like a rash.
Well, I said before, I'm very ordinary. I'm very usual. There's nothing interesting really about me.
Apart from the odd AK-45
Well,
and landmine, yes.
apart from those little things.
Okay, well,
But
apart from those.
apart from those little things. But, I didn't really elicit suspicion. And I think that I waited until the middle of the night, and I let myself out of the government house we were staying in, and I took one of the government cars we had at our disposal, and I drove to the United Nations base in Windhoek, and I explained who I was, and they were sort of quite astonished as to what they were hearing. And one thing they did do was they called the two Russian representatives who had just arrived in Namibia, who really didn't want to know anything about me. They were on their way to a cocktail party and they didn't want to be bothered. But what they did do is they sent a telex to Moscow, and my identity was confirmed and my code name was identified and confirmed. I was known as Diana. And they verified who I was, but they said, "We're sorry, we can't help you." And then I decided I have to go it alone. And that's how I escaped. I hired a car, actually, and drove from Namibia back into South Africa, because that's a route they wouldn't have expected me to take, and then to Gaborone in Botswana, where I contacted the Soviet mission, and they helped me.
Okay, so I'm guessing there were a lot of mistakes that were made by your pursuers.
There certainly were.
That enabled you to escape.
There were.
One story I would like to ask you about, because it seems a little bit surreal, a little bit frightening, but also somewhat comical. And I'm sure this was absolutely frightening at the time. In fact,
It was
we've just got
terrifying.
one of our listeners just written in and said that you must have been petrified when you had that phone call.
Oh, wow.
And now you got the fight or flight and you're flying.
Absolutely. I didn't stop to think. I think it was a question of adrenaline taking over. And I mean, I had prepared myself so many times over the years for that phone call. I was waiting for that phone call. Part of me always was waiting for that phone call. And I just knew that I had to go.
At least it was a phone call, not a tap on the shoulder.
I think I was very fortunate. Very, very fortunate.
Now, going back to this story, I'm talking about the inverted commas Weeble.
Weeble.
And his white Toyota. So
Weeble was delightful. He was a mockery of provincial South African security police at that time, and he was just comical, really. And I had picked up surveillance. In fact, I'd picked up surveillance a few times on my way out, on my journey, on my escape. And I was aware of the fact that they were keeping tabs on me, and I was wondering when they were going to make a move. Now, I stopped at a town, and in fact, it was I stopped at a town, and I thought, well, I'm going to draw him out. I want to see who this is. So I parked the car and I went into a wimpy bar and had a coffee, etc. And this chap followed me in, and he obviously hated the sight of me. He knew exactly what I was and who I was, and he just wanted to have a go at me. And I managed to draw him out in that I sort of disappeared to the ladies, and he followed me. And I managed to sidestep him by going up another flight of stairs and then disappearing down a fire escape and making my getaway, if you like, getting back to the car in time. And he missed me, and I could hear him shouting obscenities behind me. So that's how I outed the Weeble.
I think a little part of that. Tell me if I'm getting this wrong from the book. Did you slip into the gents' toilet? And
I did.
And he went into the ladies.
He went into the ladies
and
he started shouting and screaming and kicking open the toilet doors. And some poor lady was in there, and she was disturbed by him and having a gun waved in her face. I think she was quite upset. And the reason he was called Weeble is that he was a very plump gentleman, and he seemed to sway from side to side like one of those little roly-poly Weeble toys you used to get when we were kids. So that was the story of Weeble.
And so finally, how did you end up getting back to the UK?
Well, I made my way to the Soviet mission in Gaborone. In fact, they came and picked me up. I managed to phone them, believe it or not, and I explained who I was, and I was told, stay where you are, come downstairs in half an hour and I will pick you up. And sure as anything, there he was. There was the Russian representative who came, picked me up, took me to the Russian compound in Gaborone, and apparently the South Africans were on my tail at that time, and they were very, very close to me. They were in the same town. They were probably only a few streets away. And I was told later that somebody I actually knew from high school was part of that security police contingent, and they were looking for me in Gaborone, and I managed to sidestep them very quickly and very quietly. And I was taken to the Soviet compound where I was looked after. I was debriefed by the Soviets, and they helped me escape to the UK. They put me on a plane to the UK.
Now, got to ask you, how were you treated in the UK?
In the UK, I was treated as an exile. I was treated, I would say differently. I found adjusting to civilian life very difficult at that point in time. And
because you had some protection, didn't you?
I did. I had some protection. I was protected by the Royal Protection Squad at that time. who looked after significant political figures who were in danger. And we had had a spate of assassinations in the ANC at that particular time in the 80s. A lady called Dulcie September was assassinated, and there were other attacks in European capitals. So we were well aware of the fact that ANC members of a particular profile were targets, and that I was a target as well. And I received death threats. My post was intercepted. And it was a very difficult time for me because I had post-traumatic stress disorder, which wasn't really recognized at the time, but I had very significant flashbacks about getting out of South Africa. I had nightmares. I relived some of the more unpleasant moments of that journey. And to some extent, although he was quite comical, Weeble also featured in some of those flashbacks.
Right.
So, he had his moment of fame.
I mean, there was obviously a relentless media frenzy probably around you, and I have in particular read the 1989 Washington Post article,
Right.
In which you outlined to them what was going on in South Africa. And your role for the ANC.
That's right.
Where did that story go, as in globally? Did it go globally? And did it serve to help the ANC cause?
I think it did serve to help the ANC cause. Although some of my operational methods were considered a little unorthodox, and by that I refer to the honey trap, one has to also look at what was gained intelligence-wise through that. And what South Africa was trying to do at the time in Namibia was to destabilize the elections and to influence the majority win that SWAPO would have in elections. And they did that. SWAPO came to power, but at a much, I'd say, lower majority than one anticipated. And that was probably because of the dirty tricks that South Africa was involved in. And what was important about that was that Namibia was seen as a dry run, if you like, because South Africa realized at that time that it was inevitable that the ANC would be unbanned and Nelson Mandela would be released, and that we would go forward to elections in South Africa, and that the ANC would come to power. But Namibia was an opportunity for them to try it out, to try out the dirty tricks, to try out the disinformation, to try out the attacks and assassinations, etc., that took place, and to see if that could be done on South African soil. So, the Namibia was quite a significant thing historically. And as for the emphasis of the Washington Post interview, I think that was quite significant in that it was global, and it actually brought to the world's attention, to some extent, what South Africa was doing and the lengths that South Africa would go to at that point in history to destabilize another country's elections and to upset the course of history, and to try and sabotage the ANC and Nelson being released.
Now, Nelson Mandela was released in 1990
indeed.
And became the newly elected president of the ANC in 1994. However, F.W. de Klerk, who 5 years earlier had been would have been your...
My boss.
Well, he would have been... I think at that time he would have probably been the one that would have had you killed or something. What if I know what it
definitely.
was?
I mean, I think his hands would have been
So how did it work then that this person who was, as he was, the South African leader who would have had you murdered, all of a sudden becomes the deputy president of the ANC government?
Well, it's a funny old world. And I think sometimes the path of reconciliation, however difficult that may be, is an easier path than something where one needs to settle grievances. And I think that the path of reconciliation was something that was first and foremost in minds at that particular point in South African history. And also the idea that the whites had not been abandoned, I suppose, was something that they wanted to convey. That white people's interests were still being considered in the new South Africa. And it was an extremely difficult balancing act, I think, for the ANC to have, in that one was trying to reassure the white South Africans that had been threatened, if you like, by all sorts of stories of doom and gloom, what would happen if the ANC came to power. Well, now it had happened, and it was their opportunity to actually reassure South Africans that there wasn't going to be a bloodbath. And I think that's why FW had that particular role. But, you know, it's very difficult to forget what people like that were doing in the not too distant past.
Yep.
And that's something I've always thought of.
Now, you've mentioned a word, reconciliation.
Yes.
And in 1995, the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, was formed. So what was that purpose? How did it work? And your thoughts?
Well, I suppose it was an effort to sort of, I don't mean to be blasé, or it sounds a little blasé, but it was a bit of sort of kiss and make up, if you like. It was really to aid a peaceful transference of power, if you like, and to avoid this bloodbath that people had thought would happen. And in actual fact, the transition of power was fairly peaceful on a superficial level. I mean, there were lots of things going on in the background which were not very peaceful, and there was a lot of, again, dirty tricks and death squad activity, etc. But the Truth and Reconciliation movement was really for people to be held accountable for the crimes that they had committed during the apartheid years, and to have the opportunity to apologize, if you like. And in some instances, there were very emotional scenes where, for instance, security policemen who had been responsible for the deaths of ANC operatives got the opportunity to apologize to the families. And that was extremely emotional. My problem with the TRC is that I felt it didn't go strong. It didn't go in near far enough. I felt that, yes, those people were held accountable, but what were the consequences? They were held accountable, but there were no consequences. And I want to know why there weren't those consequences. You can't just apologize for some of the things that happened. People have to be held accountable. It's about taking responsibility for the crimes of the past and making sure that that doesn't happen again, truly understanding the consequences and the suffering of the crimes of the past.
Okay, so what have you been up to in the last 30 years, Sue?
Well, I've had a very sort of interesting life. I had my own family when I came to the UK, and I put my previous experiences in a little box and forgot about them, if you like. I lived a different life. I didn't speak about what I'd done or why I'd done it. And in fact, I wasn't going to ever tell anybody or mention it ever again. But I did. And I trained as a psychotherapist, and I worked as a psychotherapist for some years. And eventually I decided that that little box of my memories of South Africa could be opened again, and that I could actually take ownership of that. And although my drop in the ocean for a new democratic South Africa is a very tiny little drop, it's still mine. And that I can own that and take responsibility for that. And I've been very open and I've been very honest about my role. And where things have been unconventional or things have been different, I've certainly taken responsibility for that and I've spoken about that. But I also think that my experiences are quite an interesting story in the evolution of South Africa, if you like, into what it is today. And you know, there are lots of struggles that are still being waged. There's a struggle against corruption. There's a struggle against crime. And this is all part of the bigger picture for South Africa, and that the struggle still continues.
I mean, having written the book now, I mean, it could reignite feelings of betrayal from some of your fellow countrymen.
Certainly it could.
And also, how did your family feel about the book?
Well, my family were very, very divided by it. I had my fair share of suffering too. I mean, it's nothing like the suffering of people who suffered under apartheid. Let me make that clear. But on a personal level, you know, the book is a lot about betrayal. And, you know, you could argue that I betrayed my country, I betrayed my race, that's been said, etc., etc. But also I suffered my own betrayals in that my father sided with the security police and was actually part of the plan to bring me back to Pretoria, to intercept me as I made my way towards Gaborone, trying to reach the Soviet mission, and to actually bring me back to South Africa, where I would be arrested and I would be probably charged with treason because I was trained abroad, and I would face 15 to 20 years in prison.
Why would he do that, Sue?
I suppose, you know, embarrassment, shame, disappointment. I suppose that he didn't expect his only child to do that, and he wanted to distance himself from that, and in the process he thought that was the best way to do it.
Okay, and as I say, he was quite happy. I mean, you were on an elimination list later on as well.
I was, yeah, and I probably still am.
And that's it. I mean, so how are you considered? Have you been back to South Africa?
I've been back to South Africa several times, and I thought it very important that my children should know where they came from. I thought it very important in later years that my children should know about my role, and I did speak openly to them about my involvement. I have sort of very mixed feelings. I feel very torn every time I go back to South Africa. I long to be back, but I feel a certain sense of displacement that I think exiles often feel. I do feel that.
Okay. So the question, how are you treated, how are you considered, a traitor or a hero?
Well, I think that's for your listeners to decide, really.
Or whoever you ask.
Or whoever you ask. It depends on who you speak to, I guess.
And so we were talking about 1995 when the ANC got in. Has the ANC changed in the 21st century, in your view?
I think the ANC has. And, you know, I'm not in a position to really criticise what's going on in the movement. I'm not living in South Africa. I'm not party to what goes on in the movement. But I would certainly say that things have changed. I mean, unfortunately, there have been scandals, there's been corruption, there's been upset. And I think all of that has served to destabilise the image of the movement and certainly move it away from the organisation that I believed in all those years ago. And, you know, there's some distance between what the organisation is now to the Freedom Charter, which is what we upheld and worked towards.
So, In your book, one of your concluding chapters is entitled "The Psyche of a Spy." How would you articulate that?
Well, I think one has to have certain, if you like, traits or characteristics in order to do this kind of work. And one has to be able to distance yourself, if you like, from the consequences, emotional consequences of your actions. And by all means, you are taking responsibility for those things by carrying out those actions. But you have to be able to walk away from that and not consider that. You have to have a certain level of detachment. And I think because of the rather dysfunctional upbringing I had with my close family, I was actually able to do that. I was able to detach myself, if you like, from the idea of betrayal, or detach myself from the idea of, some people might say, using others. I was able to do that. And not everybody can do that.
And you included a Kim Philby quote.
I certainly did. And, Philby was one of my heroes. And he said, in order to betray, one has to feel one belongs. And he never belonged. And that's something that I would say I absolutely agree with.
So you're saying, in that case, he doesn't feel as though he's betraying?
Well, exactly.
Okay.
And I mean, I think the important thing is there's a sense of unbelonging, that one doesn't have a place, that one doesn't fit, if you like. And therefore, one doesn't have those feelings of remorse or regret, for instance, that you would normally associate with betrayal. Because if you feel you don't belong, you feel you're not betraying anything. So perhaps that's the psyche of a spy. Maybe that's the important trait that people don't take into consideration. They think about excitement, they think about control, they think about other personality control issues, if you like, or traits that make a spy. But I think the important thing that people don't realize is that you have to have almost that sense of detachment and unbelonging in order to do that work.
Do you ever stop being a spy?
No, I'm afraid not.
In what way?
I think one is always watchful, one is always vigilant. Certainly the ability to assess people very quickly never goes away. That's always there. And I think there's always a sense of tension or nervousness, if you like. There's a sense of always being on edge, and that stays with you forever.
I mean, I've noticed since in the times we've met that you are very watchful of the entrances to places, where the places are. Do you still feel as though you are under threat?
I certainly think that the book has inflamed old passions, and I know that for a fact, judging from some of the feedback we've had from certain people. I know that it has inflamed some passions, and it's certainly created, or let's say it's maybe opened up a little bit of a hornet's nest in some areas. But, this was never going to be popular. This is always going to be something that's controversial, and I can live with that.
Now, you've got a copy of the book there, haven't you?
I certainly do.
Can I have a? Can you pass it over to me? Because I'd just like to see, for anybody that's watching can see, this is the book. It's called Burned, and it's The Spy South Africa Never Caught. And I'll just put this for the cameras to have a little look at, just in case, because I think it's important that anybody that wants to read your book gets the opportunity to do so, because I personally felt it was very important for me, if I was going to do an interview, to read the book.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think a lot of people will still get a lot more out of it than we've talked about, because
I hope so.
there was a build, there was a burn, there was a slow burn at the beginning, and then you came to be into action.
I think there's a lot that one can identify with in the book. It's not only about espionage, it's about idealism, it's about being young, It's about betrayal, it's about disappointment, it's about being alone, if you like, and having to use your own resources. And I think one of the themes of Burned is that one actually has resources that you don't realize you have. And I certainly discovered those when I was alone in the field. I didn't realize that I could be that strong.
Because at some stage you felt that you were abandoned in the field, didn't you?
Oh, I did. I certainly did. And I felt that I had been sort of thrown to the wolves by my handler, if you like, because there was no route out, there was no escape route, there was no money, there were no false papers, there was no safe house to go to. And to some extent, I suppose I was. But then you have to also argue that you can't do that sort of work without being resourceful. And that, you can't have your hand held. But also your handler is responsible ultimately for your health, your mental health, your psychological health, and, your stability and
your physical health.
And your physical health. Yeah. You absolutely need to have some degree of support out there. Certainly one can do it alone, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's not easy.
Okay. And I'm going to close by saying, what next for Sue Dobson?
Well, I don't know, is the answer. Possibly another book. That's a possibility. We may go on to develop the book more. That's a possibility as well. And I just see my retirement as being quite an interesting one, really. I don't think it could ever be conventional or peaceful. I think there'll always be a few surprises around the corner for me.
I'm sure there will be. And I'm going to close and say thanks and a promise of a cup of coffee.
Oh, sounds good to me.
Thank you so much, Sue,
Thank you
for joining me. And I do hope that listeners have enjoyed it and that they read your book.
Oh, thank you, Mike.
This has gone out on Facebook, Twitter, Mixcloud and YouTube. So anybody wants to look at it, they can
Excellent.
see it again.
Thank
Okay?
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
Bye-bye.
Mike. Thank you.
All done. Sorry, I was just trying to do 2 or 3 things.